Story 1. The coffee cup on Mrs. Higgins' porch railing hadn't moved in 3 days, and from my vantage point, I could see the mold starting to bloom on the ceramic rim. Most people walk past a house and see the brick, the paint, the trimmed hedges. I see the patterns. I see the rhythm of a living home. Mrs. Higgins was a creature of absolute habit. 7 a.m., Earl Grey on the porch. 7:15 a.m., she waters the petunias. 7:30 a.m., she goes inside to watch the morning news. But for 72 hours, that cup had sat there, a silent beacon of wrongness in a neighborhood that prided itself on being right. The strange thing wasn't just the cup, it was the movement inside. At night, I'd see her silhouette in the living room window. The blue light of the television would flicker, and her shadow would pass back and forth. If she was sick, why was she pacing? If she was hurt, why was she up? I sat in my darkened kitchen, binoculars pressed to my eyes, watching the show. It was 2 a.m. on the third night when I noticed the glitch. The silhouette walked past the window, holding what looked like a wine glass. It paused, took a sip, and walked off screen. Exactly 10 seconds later, it happened again. Same speed, same pause, same sip. I lowered the binoculars, my breath fogging the glass. It wasn't a person. It was a loop. Someone had set up a projection or a recording to mimic occupancy, a Home Alone tactic for the digital age. But why? Mrs. Higgins was a 70-year-old widow with a pension and a cat. She wasn't a target for high-stakes corporate espionage. I decided to check the mail. It was the oldest trick in the book, but effective. I walked my dog Buster at 3 a.m. The street was dead silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like a wool blanket. I paused at her mailbox. It was stuffed full. Flyers, bills, ominous weight envelopes. As I let Buster sniff the perimeter of her fence, a smell hit me. Not the smell of decay. That would have been tragic, but simple.
It was the smell of chemicals. Acrid, biting, like acetone and bleach mixed with burning plastic. It was coming from the basement fence. The Mrs. Higgins in the window took another sip of wine. The loop reset. I went back to my house and called the non-emergency line. I told them I hadn't seen her in days and smelled gas. I lied about the gas, but it was the only way to get them there fast without sounding like a conspiracy theorist. When the squad car pulled up, the lights cut through the suburban dark. The officer knocked. No answer. The silhouette kept pacing. The officer knocked harder. Nothing. They broke the door down. I watched from my porch, hidden in the shadows of my trellis. The shouting started almost immediately, not from Mrs. Higgins, but from the police. "Clear! Room clear! We have a... Jesus, what is this?" Minutes later, a hazmat team was called. Mrs. Higgins wasn't in the house. In fact, Mrs. Higgins had been in Florida for the last month visiting her sister. I found that out later. The person in the house had been her nephew. He'd been using her basement to cook a new, highly volatile synthetic drug while she was away. To cover his tracks, he'd set up a high-end projector against the sheer curtains, playing a looped video of his aunt he'd taken at Christmas, hoping the neighbors wouldn't notice the 24-hour industrial operation downstairs. But he made a mistake. He forgot the coffee cup. The police brought him out in cuffs, coughing and covered in yellow dust. He glared at the gathered neighbors, his eyes wild. He looked right at me. I didn't look away. I just took a sip of my own coffee. He thought he had the perfect camouflage. He thought suburbia was blind. He didn't know I was watching. Story 2. I knew the man kissing his wife in the driveway wasn't her husband, even though he was wearing her husband's face. The Sullivans, Mark and Sarah, lived directly across the street. Mark was a boring guy.
He was a data analyst, drove a silver sedan, and had a terrible slice when he practiced golf in the yard. He was right-handed. I'd watched him whittle away at his handicap for 3 years. He did everything with his right hand. Opened doors, held his beer, threw the ball for their golden retriever. The man currently gripping Sarah's waist was using his left hand to stroke her hair. It wasn't just the hand, it was the posture. Mark slumped. His shoulders were always rounded forward from years of desk work. This guy stood like a soldier, spine straight, chin up. But he had Mark's receding hairline, Mark's nose, Mark's distinctively awful fashion sense involving cargo shorts and polo shirts. Sarah pulled away, laughing, looking more alive and happy than I'd seen her in a decade. She swatted his arm playfully and went inside. The man, not Mark, stayed in the driveway. He looked around the neighborhood. His gaze swept over the manicured lawns, the sprinklers, the tricycles. Then his eyes locked on my window. I froze. Usually people look right through you. Not this guy. He saw me. He didn't wave. He just stared, a flat, predatory look that sent a cold spike down my spine. Then he turned, picked up Mark's golf club with his left hand, and walked into the garage. I started a log. Monday, Mark leaves for work. Posture, slumped. Hand, right. Tuesday, Mark leaves for work. Posture, rigid. Hand, left. Wednesday, right-handed Mark returns. He looks exhausted. He argues with Sarah in the front yard about money. Thursday, left-handed Mark mows the lawn. He does it in half the time the real Mark takes. He fixes the broken gutter that has been dangling for 6 months. Sarah brings him lemonade, and they make out on the porch like teenagers. It was twins. It had to be. But why hide it? I did some digging online. Mark Sullivan didn't have a brother. He was an only child. I checked public records, yearbooks, everything. No twin. So who was the lefty?
The situation escalated on Saturday. The real Mark was home. I could tell because he dropped his keys trying to open the door and cursed loudly. He went inside. An hour later, I saw the garage door open. Left-handed Mark walked out. They were both in the house at the same time. I grabbed my camera with a telephoto lens. I needed proof. I aimed it at the living room window. The blinds were partially open. Inside, the two men were standing face to face. They were identical, down to the cargo shorts. But they weren't hugging. They were screaming. I couldn't hear the words, but the body language was violent. The real Mark was pleading, his hands up. The left-handed imposter was advancing on him, shoving him back. Sarah walked into the room. She didn't look shocked to see two of them. She looked annoyed. She stepped between them, saying something sharp. The left-handed man backed down. That's when it clicked. It wasn't a sinister invasion. It was a job share. They were running a scam. One life, two men. Maybe they were cousins, maybe lookalikes, maybe off-the-grid brothers. One worked the boring job and paid the bills. The other, the capable, charming, left-handed one, did the home repairs and kept the wife happy. They were splitting the burden of a modern suburban existence. But the balance was shifting. The left-handed one didn't want to share anymore. That night, I saw the garage door open again at 2 a.m. The silver sedan backed out. The driver was sitting rigid, upright. The lefty. He drove to the end of the street, stopped, and opened the trunk. He pulled out a large, heavy duffel bag and tossed it into the storm drain easement behind the cul-de-sac. He drove back, parked, and went inside. The next morning, Mark came out to get the paper. He waved at me with his left hand. He looked happy, relaxed. I waited until he went to work. I walked down to the easement. The bag was gone, likely washed into the tunnels or buried deep in the brush.
But I found something caught in the brambles nearby. A golf glove, a right-handed golf glove. It was stained with something dark and rusty. I looked back at the Sullivan house. Sarah was on the porch, drinking coffee. She looked at me, then looked at the spot where I was standing. She raised her mug in a silent toast. She knew. She preferred the upgrade. I went home and locked my doors. I threw the glove in the trash. In this neighborhood, we mind our own business, especially when the neighbors have finally found marital bliss. Story 3.
The digging started at 3 a.m., right after the black SUV with the diplomatic plates sped away. My neighbor to the left, Mr. Vance, was a consultant. That's what he told everyone at the block party. He was charming, wore expensive suits, and traveled a lot. His house was a fortress, high fences, cameras on every corner, and blinds that were never, ever open. But sound travels, especially through the clay soil of our subdivision. I was in my basement, working on a restored jukebox, when I felt it. A rhythmic thumping. Thud, thud, thud. It was coming from the shared wall side. Vance didn't have a permit for a renovation, and at 3 a.m., you don't build a man cave at 3 a.m. I went out to my backyard. The air was thick with humidity. I peered over the fence. Vance's yard was dark, but I could see a faint red glow coming from his cellar doors. They were open. A figure emerged, hauling a wheelbarrow. He dumped the contents near the rose bushes. It wasn't dirt. It looked like shredded paper. Mounds of it. He went back down. 5 minutes later, another load. This wasn't gardening. This was a purge. I went back inside and grabbed my directional microphone, a remnant from my days in audio engineering. I aimed it at the open cellar doors from my second-story bedroom window. The sound was clear, the hum of industrial shredders, and something else, voices. Time is tight. The flight leaves at 6.
Is the server wiped? A man's voice, harsh. Wiped and drilled. Physical drives are destroyed. A second voice replied. What about the assets? Liquidated. But we have a problem with the containment. Containment? My grip on the microphone tightened. The unit is leaking, the second voice said. If we leave it, they'll find it within the week. Let them find it. We'll be in non-extradition by then. Just seal the wall. Use the quick-dry concrete. My heart hammered against my ribs. Leak. Containment. Seal the wall. They were walling something up. Or someone. I remembered the SUV. The diplomatic plates. Vance wasn't just a consultant. He was a cleaner. A fixer for people who had too much money and too many secrets. I heard the sound of a trowel scraping against brick. They were finishing up. If I called the cops now, by the time they got a warrant, Vance would be in the air, and whatever was behind that wall would be entombed. I had to force their hand. I ran down to my basement. I knew the layout of these houses perfectly. They were all built by the same developer in the 80s. The main water line for the street ran directly parallel to the shared wall where they were digging. I grabbed my heavy sledgehammer. I didn't aim for the wall. I aimed for my own intake pipe, right where it vanished into the foundation on the shared side. It was risky. It was stupid. But I swung. Clang. The pipe shuddered. Clang. A hiss of water. Clang. The pipe burst. High-pressure municipal water exploded into my basement, instantly flooding the floor. But more importantly, the pressure shockwave traveled. From the other side of the wall, I heard a shout. Damn it! Water! It's coming through the fresh mortar. The wall is collapsing. Get the drive! Forget the drive. The water is rising too fast. It's going to short the grid. I ran upstairs and dialed 911. My basement pipe burst, and I think it's flooding the neighbor's house too. I hear screaming.
Fire trucks arrived in 4 minutes. Because of the flood risk, they didn't need a warrant to enter Vance's basement to shut off the main. I stood outside, wet up to my knees, watching. They brought Vance out first, soaking wet and furious. Then they brought out the other man. And then, the firemen stopped. They called for backup. They didn't bring out a body, and they didn't bring out a monster. They brought out cages, stacked exotic bird cages, containing Spix's macaws, the rarest birds in the world, thought to be extinct in the wild, worth millions on the black market. Vance was running a smuggling ring. The containment leak was a bird flu outbreak he was trying to hide by burying the sick birds behind a concrete wall before fleeing the country. The shredded paper in the garden? Forged import documents. As the paramedics checked me over, one of the firemen walked by, shaking his head. Lucky you hit that pipe, Cal. Another hour, and those birds would have suffocated behind that concrete. I looked at Vance, who was being shoved into a police cruiser. He stared at me with pure venom. He knew. He knew that pipes don't just burst from the side like that. I gave him a little wave. My basement was ruined. The restoration would cost thousands.
But as I watched them load the bright blue macaws into the animal control van, safe and alive, I knew it was worth it. Besides, I'd been meaning to remodel anyway.